What's up, AP Euro family? We are days away, hours away from your exam, and I know it might seem a little bit stressful, but it's exciting. We're close. The finish line is just there ahead. Okay, so for today, I thought I would throw together a lightning quick attack of review on all of the units. One last look at them in order. I'm going to try to keep each unit to less than 2 minutes. Can it be done? Let's find out. So Unit 1 is the Renaissance. Remember, we're coming out of the Middle Ages, the quote-unquote Dark Ages. So for 1,000 years, Europe has been decentralized, lacking unification, lacking that glory of the old Roman past. And we get Petrarch writing letters to dead people and letting us know that there needs to be a rebirth, a Renaissance. And so it starts in Italy. Why? Because they're the ones connected to the luxury trade routes to the east. They're getting gold from Africa. They've got these wealthy competing city-states and a growing middle class that's connected to merchant trade. And so it begins there in the ancestral home of the Roman Empire. The focuses are humanism, which looks at this ancient connection. We call it classicism to the Roman world. And that really takes on some other characteristics like secularism. Even though there's Christianity, we're focusing on man's role, this new understanding of our role in the universe, cosmology, right? And so we look at now literature and art with kind of a new fondness, not as a means to understanding only God, but maybe understanding ourselves. And so wealthy people patronize art, and so artists are kind of half genius, but also kind of half, a prostitute of the wealthy to kind of propagandize their messages. Now, in the Northern Renaissance, quote unquote, the Christian humanist movement has this love of ancient languages and a focus on classicism, but also a connection to Christianity, using the Gospels as a way of kind of reforming or giving us a real focus as to what life should really be about. And so a little less about that kind of fancy, playboyish flamboyance of the Italian Renaissance and more modesty and more of a connection to hardworking frugality and kind of a Christ-based life. Now, these ideas flooded into Europe thanks to Gutenberg's printing press. Right, and this printing press not only helped spread the ideas of the Enlightenment, of the Renaissance, it would lead to things like the Enlightenment, the Reformation, right, and the spreading of texts, and really the inability of the authorities of the time to censor or control media as they once had. So speaking of the authorities, we have a change really in the way that we see government. It's the growing concept of nationalism or nation states. We call them new monarchs, right? Spain is no longer a feudal connection of different territories. We've got a unified Spanish monarchy thanks to the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. And by 1492, the Moors have been defeated. We've got the unification of Spain. Columbus goes out and starts putting Spanish flags in the New World. It's the rise of the nation state. We see this in France with Francis. We see this in England. All right, so everywhere we kind of look, there's this new preference for nationalism. Partially, then, this spurs this conquest or this exploration of the New World and Southeast Asia, partially because of the growing attitudes of the Renaissance and partially because of better technological equipment and science of the time period. And what this does is, long term, it creates this competition amongst European nations. And so as they grow in power, they also grow in rivalry with other states. And so we see this, for example, in the quest for colonies of South America between Portugal and Spain, the quest for colonies in North America between England and France, eventually bringing us to the 7 Years' War, this great global conflict. All right. The other thing that colonization brought about was this new Columbian exchange. Products of the old world and the new world being shared, sadly, diseases wiping out Native Americans who lacked immunities, higher calorie product coming back to Europe, and allowing places like Poland and Ireland to sustain greater populations. And as the native populations died, sadly, that meant that there was a labor shortage or a need for cheap labor. And so this is also where we see the triangle trade bring into the mix a greater influence of African slavery, specifically looking at the sugar trade and some of the cash crops like tobacco and cotton. Okay, That time period of the Renaissance is happening at the same time as the Reformation. Now, the Reformation, right, is a religious revolution in essence. Martin Luther, a Christian man, a Catholic man, is turned off by these ideas of papal abuse or excess and indulgences, which he thought were a complete lie to the people. You cannot buy heaven. And so Luther instead promoted what he called the three solas, right? Through grace alone, through faith alone, you come to God. Grace alone, you earn salvation. And through scripture alone, you find the authority of God. So no hierarchy needed. Okay, we then also saw people like John Calvin challenge the authority of the Catholic Church. Now, John Calvin, unique, he had this idea of double predestination, that you were either saved or damned already before being born. And so really, Reformed life, Calvinist life, then really gravitated around how do I know if I'm saved? How do I know if I'm part of the elect? And there were really two ways of knowing that. One, theocracy. Can I live in a place like Geneva, Switzerland, where they have a theocratic, very strongly religious government? Eventually, it's what the Puritans would impose in London in like the interregnum years of the English Civil War under Oliver Cromwell. The other way is to look at your financial blessings, right? And so you look at the Renaissance in the North and this middle class that was already frugal and pretty high earning, joint stock companies, this wealthy middle class, investment class, they are pulled to this idea because it, in essence, teaches that not only am I frugal, but I'm divinely frugal, right? That God wants me to be this way. And the reason why I hate my Spanish overlords or my French overlords isn't just because they're like Catholic or because I'm cheap. It's because that I'm saved and they're damned, right? That they cannot live a theocratic, boring, virtuous, gospel-driven life, right? We also noticed in England the English Reformation take a very unique flavor. So, unlike Calvin or Luther on the continent who had genuine theological concerns, really Henry only had the need for his personal or hereditary stability of creating dynasty in England. But it opened the door to eventually religious turmoil. Initially, it was the pilgrimage of grace, but then long term, it was the feuding politics of his children, and then long term, leading to the English Civil War. So Edward, his son, sickly but Protestant, Mary, a Catholic because her mom was Catherine of Aragon, and then eventually Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, bringing England back into the Protestant fold, defeating the Spanish Armada in 1599 and allying herself with Protestant nations like the Netherlands on the continent. The Catholics didn't take this sitting down. We have the Counter-Reformation, the famous Council of Trent, where they looked at things like reforming some of the abuses of pluralism and simony, making a more literate clergy, but then also reaffirming their seven sacraments and some of their traditions, and eventually issuing things like the Index. Also, this is really the height of the Baroque movement, where we see a greater preference in art for this overbearing emotional message of light and dark and goodness in the world. And eventually that will transition into the age of absolutism. Unit 3, right, where some secular leaders then take Baroque and then apply it to their secular power, creating large palaces out of marble and alabaster and having sweeping the fanfares and this great music to kind of celebrate the regality of the state. Okay, so how did we get to this age of absolutism and constitutionalism? Well, finances, money from the New World, places like Spain with their silver coming in, fur trade from North America for the French. Really, they use that money to support their state using mercantilism, right? Being self-sufficient in their economy and using colonies. Now, the English Civil War is kind of an interesting spot, and the College Board starts there because it was an absolutist nation, England, but then eventually it failed at absolutism and became an example of constitutionalism. Right, so Elizabeth I, the quote-unquote virgin queen, dies without an heir, and so by 1603, England is in a dynastic crisis. Her cousin, James VI of Scotland, will become James I of England. Now, he is an absolutist. He had the true laws of a monarch. He claimed divine right. He told Parliament that they had no right to meet or to govern unless he gave them those rights. Pretty bold guy. He's the same guy that gives us the King James Bible, Jamestown Colony, right? A very top-heavy guy, right? He leaves then an absolutist policy and a chafed, angry Parliament to his son Charles I. And Charles I really struggles here. And partially because war is constantly looming between the Netherlands with France. And so in order to finance these constant wars, he's forced to call Parliament. But Parliament are filled with very reformed, Puritan, hardline Protestants that are looking for both their political power and wanting Parliament to be kind of the new control, the new representative of the people, and also looking out for the religious control and showing opposition to the Anglican Church, wanting freedom to practice their faith and not conform to Anglicanism. Many steps along the way, whether it's forced loans or ship money, right, Charles calling Parliament and then sending Parliament home, the famous short Parliament, right, it eventually leads to conflict and a civil war. Charles loses both the war and his head. Oliver Cromwell takes over, creates a military dictatorship that's Puritan. They shut down the playhouses and the bars, and the people are sad and they hate it. Bible quotes on their armor. I mean, I would say probably ethnic cleansing against the Irish and a religious cleansing against Catholics in Ireland to pacify any of his resistance. And when Cromwell dies, he dies a very unpopular man, so unpopular that eventually they restore the Stuart dynasty, and we have Charles II and eventually James II. James really lacking the ability to kind of build consensus in government. And so by the time we get into the 1680s, another civil war looks like it's looming, and so Parliament hatches an idea to avoid war. They're going to offer James's daughter Mary and her husband William and Mary, the opportunity to start a bloodless coup, a bloodless revolution, and knock Daddy-O out of power. That's the Glorious Revolution. There's an Enlightenment vibe to it in 1688. We have the English Bill of Rights, right, which not only gives legal freedoms to the individual in England, but also puts the power in Parliament, creating this idea of a constitutional monarchy and the power of written law. So it really limits the power that the monarchy will play. Now, that is not true across all of the continent. Right? Other constitutional states or republican states, the Dutch would be republican. We don't have a great absolutist power there. And so we have a confederation of very affluent states. This is the Dutch Golden Age in the 1600s. However, they're also in great war and great rivalry with the absolutist power of France under Louis XIV, right? And he builds Versailles. He uses the intendant system that was created by Louis XIII, his father, and Cardinal Richelieu, and continues to expand that. And after the Fronde, he's paranoid of noble power, and then uses things like the noble of the robe distinction to pacify his nobles and bring them to Versailles, which is a gilded cage where he forces them to serve and live kind of under his spyish eye, partying them into passivity, which is an idea stole by Peter the Great. Another party animal uses many of these same ideas. He creates the table of ranks to force service nobility. He builds St. Petersburg and the Peterhof Palace, very similar to Versailles, requires nobles to live there, builds a navy, creates this mystique of the power of the monarchy. We also saw the rise of absolutism in Prussia under Frederick William and eventually Frederick I, the great soldier king. Austria is another example of an absolutist state under the power of the Habsburgs. Right? Moving into Unit 4 then, in connection to this Renaissance and Reformation and exploration, science is at its kind of an apex moment here during the scientific revolution, really astronomy being the major focus. And so using the heavens for navigation, using astrolabes and sextants, gave people a better understanding of the sky, and that's where we get heliocentrism. So Copernicus creates this concept when he wrote on the heavenly spheres, or the revolution of heavenly spheres. That work is continued by people like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, and eventually all the way to Galileo and Newton and the like. Now, that scientific age also gives birth to a philosophical age known as the Enlightenment. And it's not surprising the Enlightenment happens now. It's in response to absolutism. So instead of divine right, nay, we have popular sovereignty and social contracts. Right? And so we replace the traditional explanations for things with these new logic, reason-driven arguments. And so almost using the scientific method and deductive reasoning that we'd see in science, but applying it to philosophical matters. Some of the big takeaways of the Enlightenment then would be concepts like the social contract, the ideas of Hobbes that people were naturally evil and we needed a Leviathan-styled government, a commonwealth to crush those who would do us harm and protect our security, eventually evolves into the ideas of Locke, of life, liberty, and property. right? This idea that there's a social contract in which government looks out for those things. He believed in a tabula rasa, that people weren't good or bad, but became through nurture. And eventually, on the other end of the spectrum, we got to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the ass man, right, who was wagging it around for them girls, but he understood that people were naturally good, a noble savage, but it was society and our vices that actually brought out the evil in mankind. And so a social contract was necessary, but not just with government, but with all members of society, and not just to politically protect my securities and rights, but also my morality, which is where Rousseau is also unique with this concept of the general will, right? That there is like this unknown but kind of accessible power that links people together, our collective desires, right? And that it takes an intellectual who can maybe assess what is needed, what is wanted, or maybe not understood. So it's not democracy, it's this enlightened republicanism. Right, other key names to note here. Voltaire is arguing for religious freedom and the freedoms of speech are basic kind of Bill of Rights kind of things. Montesquieu is arguing for separations of power. Diderot is making the encyclopedia. Printing presses are increasing the access to knowledge and literacy, and that will bring us to the age of revolution. And so by unifying, we have conflict, crisis, revolution. And so I'm going to skip kind of that British part. We kind of hinted that already. And let's look at the French Rev. The French Rev is partially an Enlightenment experiment, right? We can't have people like Abbé Say or Abbé Sieyès writing what is the third estate if we don't have these enlightened arguments, right? We don't have Robespierre if we don't have Jean-Jacques Rousseau to fuel his ideas, right? But we also have crippling famine. We have crushing debt by the government, whether it was the French and Indian War or supporting America during its revolution against Britain. Right, the government is broke. Louis XVI, a poor king for the moment, and so they call finance ministers Calonne and eventually Jacques Necker. Necker's advice was we have to call the Estates General and get an endorsement, a mandate from the people. Once the Estates General is called, the argument about what really is government and the role of representation in government allows Enlightenment discourse to fuel this third estate. And eventually we get to things like the tennis court oath, which envisions a national assembly and a constitution. Fast forwarding, after the king tries to flee the nation, right, he will go on trial. Again, an Enlightenment exercise in how they try a king. He's eventually beheaded because it's the will of the people, so says Robespierre. And then we enter into these troubled years of what we know as the radical phase of the revolution. The Committee of Public Safety steers in an increasingly kind of bloody and heavy authoritarian regime. Price controls in the economy, war being fought on the frontier, public watch committees, and public executions, right? This growing radicalism until we get to the Thermidorian reaction, right? Girondins, these countryside people, they loathe the secularism, the de-Christianization of the radical phase, things like the calendar and the metric system. They wanted a more moderate understanding of government, and so eventually under Thermidor, those factions win. Robespierre is beheaded, and we enter into something known as the Directory. Now, the Directory was this very slow, ineffective executive five-man directory, and it lasts until 1799 when Napoleon is called home from his campaign in Egypt and eventually places his coup on government and becomes Emperor of France. Key things to remember about Napoleon. Early on, he focuses on domestic reforms. Right, he's a great reformer early on with things like the Bank of France, the Lycée system, and certainly the Napoleonic Code. Those things that are transmitted, shared across Europe as Napoleon's many campaigns share those ideas in the places in which his boots marched or trod upon, right? And so we see this liberalism expand across the continent, first in northern Italy, then eventually when he kills the Holy Roman Empire after the battles of Berlin and Jena. we then see the creation of this Rheinbund, a new growing sense of German nationalism. It's partially more easy to maintain the administrative control in this new Rheinbund, and so he spreads it, eventually losing in 1812 to a coalition in Russia, and then again at the Battle of Nations. Exile, comes back, 100 days, loses again at Waterloo, exiled and died. However, much more than that is maybe the paranoia or what he unleashed, and that is this liberalism, this age of great reform, which is met with coalition and the Congress of Vienna hosted by Metternich, and this new guiding hand of this Congress community of conservatism to try to undo the movements of Napoleon. And that's where we get romanticism partially, is this growing conservatism, this anti-enlightenment, this anti-rationale, and more of a focus on Christian themes, right and wrong, kind of hearkening back to the good old days of the Middle Ages before we had this Enlightenment time period. And of course, the Romantic movement also very much against industrialization, the dangers of modernity, which brings us nicely into our next unit, which is Unit 6, Industrialization and its Effects. England was going to always be the leader of this Industrial Revolution because it had all the right ingredients for the recipe. A massive empire, surplus population, farming that allowed not just for surplus population, but these people to move into urban centers that were sustainable, which is where factories could be created. They had already a sense of liberalism and enlightenment. Adam Smith creates the wealth of nations, and that fuels this bourgeois middle class that will create the factory systems and make a ton of money. However, government can't stay out of it for long. They need to reform the system, right? Too many things are going wrong. And so this is also the great shift in government. Right? Early on, when we looked in like the 18 teens and 1820s, under this Congress system, right, conservatism was still dominant, right? And so we saw things like the Luddites being unsuccessful, frame smashing and whatnot. The Peterloo Massacre, how long the Chartist movement dwelled as they were looking for solutions to factory problems and universal suffrage. However, by the time we get into the 1830s, we have the Reform Bill of 1832, the Factory Act of 1833, the Communist Manifesto hits in 1848. Government is forced to be more responsive, or they fear the possibility of revolution like we see on the continent. And so by the time we get to the late 1800s, we have people like Gladstone and Disraeli battling back and forth to out-reform one another. And so we end with things like police, fire, compulsory education, housing acts, potential for Irish home rule, right? I mean, a great turn in government. Right. We also then see the age of revolution on the continent where government maybe wasn't quite as receptive. In France, we had revolutions in 1830 and 1848, really kind of this weird pairing between the urban worker and this middle class, right? And eventually kind of the betrayal of the urban worker by the middle class, okay? We also see the rise of nationalist movements, right? So in 1821, we had Greece breaking away from the Ottoman Empire. By 1830, we have Belgian independence. We have the failed attempt at Polish independence. We have stirrings of German nationalism. We have stirrings of Austrian nationalism and Hungarian nationalism all throughout Eastern Europe, which brings us to Unit 7, and other nationalisms and some successful attempts at unification in Italy and Germany. Right, both of those are examples of top-down unification, meaning in Piedmont and Sardinia, you had Cavour, right, as minister in Piedmont, using his position of power to kind of manipulate the situation, tried to play Napoleon III as a bit of a fool to get him to agree to support him with troops and money and move out the Austrians, but he had never any intention of allowing the French to hold authority there either. He partners up with people like Giuseppe Garibaldi and his red shirts, and they create a popularist kind of military push through southern Italy, and eventually they meet at Rome to try to drive the French out of Rome and unify Italy, which succeeds because the French were in no position to defend Rome, because at the exact same time in history of the Franco-Prussian War, and as Prussia is architecting or engineering its unification, this Franco-Prussian War would play the ultimate last step, where Prussia unifies Germany under one banner, the Prussian banner, and in success in conquering France in this war, the Peace of Frankfurt announces the new unified German state. All right, this is also the great age of science and progress. We mentioned people like Joseph Lister, Edwin Chadwick, for example, Dr. Snow and the Broad Street Pump, Freud, Darwin, social Darwinism, Karl Lueger in Austria, Spencer Herbert, taking these ideas and applying them in kind of a racist, quasi-half-science idea, where we see then the spurring of things like eugenics, for example, coming out. We also see those racist ideologies applied to the other great phenomenon of the late 19th century, and that is new imperialism. Okay, the need for raw materials and markets to sell off their goods push Europeans to go into places like Africa and Asia and expand their empires. We have the famous Congress of Berlin, where Bismarck and this new German state kind of play the central figure. Possible war breaking out in Eastern Europe. We see the power and the influence of Disraeli when he shows up and basically kind of scolds Russia publicly. They create this idea of effective occupation and how colonization will work in those new colonies, right? Europeans are successful often in this age of new imperialism. So we look at their impressive technology kind of giving them the advantage. So whether it's steamships and trains, whether it's the Maxim machine gun or Hotchkiss guns, when we look at like the 1830 Opium Wars, or we look at wars like the British taking over the Zulu Empire, technology really gives Europe the nudge. All right, so then we go into our last two units. Unit 8 is looking at global conflicts. We look at the four main causes of World War I, and really we focus mainly on nationalism, right? This growing sense of nationalism. People wanting to create their own nation states, going back to the 1820s, as I mentioned, with the Greeks, 1830s with the Belgians and the Poles. We can follow that right up into the modern era then. Places like Northern Ireland, I should say Northern Ireland, Ireland at this point wanting freedom from Britain. In Eastern Europe, right, we've got breakaway states. So in 1830, Serbia declared its independence. And now that we're in the early 1900s, we have these Balkan wars breaking out, and other states like Bosnia wanting to also then be free in this pan-Slavic nature where Slavs, Russian-esque people, want to break away from these sick and dying multi-ethnic empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, other people like Armenians looking to break away from the Ottoman Empire, right? Challenges to the old establishment. World War I is a bloodbath. Over 10 million soldiers die in the war. It leads to the Treaty of Versailles and horrible reparations, limits on size of troops and militaries, a scolding of Germany, a stealing of their colonies through the mandate system. And then the 20s are a tough time of economic downsizing. And by the stock market crash of 1929, Europe is really hurting, especially in Central Europe and Germany, a highly industrialized nation. And this gives birth to the rise of fascism, the totalitarian state. Like total war of World War I, the growing commonality of socialism meant that governments were already dabbling with much more control, government work programs and whatnot. And so this made it kind of an easy vehicle for people like Mussolini in Italy, Franco in Spain, and Hitler in Nazi Germany to seize power. All right, Blitzkrieg is a new style of warfare. Unlike the trench warfare of World War I, it's lightning quick, and by 1940, most of Europe is already under the Nazi jackboot. England stands alone, gets pummeled in the Blitz. Eventually, America joins after getting hit at Pearl Harbor. It's really the Soviet Union who turns the tide of the war with victory at Stalingrad, and eventually by D-Day, wedging them in. But it becomes clear as the wedging of the Nazis takes place in 1944 and 1945 that the real powers in the world were America and the Soviet Union, and that gives rise to the Cold War, which is Unit 9. So Cold War and contemporary issues. By 1945, America has the A-bomb. They think they have technological superiority. They were wrong, right? Russia follows not that much later. Europe is divided. The Soviet Union will heavily influence the elections and politics of Eastern Europe, eventually creating these satellite states and what would become the Warsaw Pact, hidden behind the Iron Curtain, as Churchill called it. On the flip side, on the West, right, America and her allies become the NATO nations. They have the Truman Doctrine, which pledges containment, and so a series of Cold War conflicts erupt, whether it's Korea trying to stop dominoes from falling, whether it's Vietnam and protecting, the pledge of Truman, containment against communism, against a French ally of ours in Vietnam. Doesn't really matter, right? America is really kind of showing its leadership. There's an arms race, there's brinksmanship, there's a technological race. Eventually, kind of hitting its apex at the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, when we get into the 1970s, so we had Stalin. Stalin dies in 1953. Khrushchev takes over. He's the one who really pushes this de-Stalinization, but a more global face to communism. He's the one who pushes the Cuban Missile Crisis. But by the 70s, we have Leonid Brezhnev. He invades Afghanistan. By the 80s, it seems that Soviet-style communism is no longer going to be sustainable. And as nationalist movements give rise again in Eastern Europe, so for example, like the Czech or the Prague Spring, the Velvet Revolution, or Solidarity in Poland, it becomes clear that the Soviet Union is really going to, struggle to try to maintain control of these nationalist agendas. And so things like perestroika and glasnost, this openness created by Mikhail Gorbachev, is a warning, right, that there has to be reform inside the Soviet spheres. And by the time we get to 1991, Yeltsin and his government coup allows these states to basically walk away from the Soviet Union, thus collapsing their empire and creating inner turmoil and a return to Russia. By 1993, you have a European Union, thanks to the Peace of Maastricht, because they're trying to invite European nations back into this sense of community so that we don't have a bipolar, conflicted world again. Modern issues that we have today, decolonization and nationalism was a big one. Feminist movement in the 1960s and 70s, things like Now, for example, or The Second Sex, written by Du Beauvoir. These are kind of quintessential steps for women fighting against the glass ceiling and for greater gender equality. Lastly, we did kind of hint at migration in this modern age, sadly, as the world thawed out from this Cold War. That led to things like terrorism and the rise of authoritarian states in the Middle East and Africa, because Cold War weapons were super cheap to get. And so things like the Syrian civil war, for example, caused major refugee crisis. And as those refugees entered Europe, kind of forced the EU to figure out what to do. And some nations not really thrilled with it. Greece went bankrupt 1,000 times, or 3 or, I don't know, 8, something like that. And then England wanting to Brexit. I know that's a lot. Hopefully that helps, guys, but it's only hours away before you take your digital exam. Good luck to you all.